The cinema of the nation of Italy has been one of the most important and influential in the world since the early days of film. Italy has given the world several of the most acclaimed directors and won more Oscars for Best Foreign Film than any other nation. Italian filmmakers have had success in many different genres and modes, including art house, horror, comedy, and western. Italian films were quite successful during this silent era. They produced a variety of genres, but the rest of the world mostly associated them with epics. These were historical films that usually took place in classical times, with some occasionally set in the Middle Ages or later. They were known for their extravagant sets and massive crowds of extras. A key director in this genre was Giovanni Pastrone, who none other than Martin Scorsese credits with inventing the epic genre. His 30-minute-long 1911 film The Fall of Troy told the story of the Trojan War using over 800 actors. It was very successful and led to Italy making more expensive and ambitious movies. Pastrone's feature film Cabiria was one of the biggest and came out 3 years later. Cabiria had even bigger sets and thousands of extras and was set during ancient times as well. It took place during the Second Punic War that pitted Rome against Carthage and features spectacles such as a volcano erupting, and used real elephants when depicting the crossing of the Alps by Carthaginian General Hannibal. The cinematography is highly seminal in Cabiria through its use of a moving camera, and it is credited as the first film to use a dolly for tracking shots. Cabiria also introduced the strongman Maciste character that would go on to star in a series of films that lasted until the 1920s. Both Cabiria and another hit epic, Quo Vadis, helped make the epic genre an international phenomenon. Quo Vadis was based on the famous Henryk Sienkiewicz novel of the same name that takes place during the reign of Roman Emperor Nero. It too had thousands of extras, and its 2-hour runtime was quite long for the era. Other important silent epics include Julius Caesar and the Last Days of Pompeii. Italy also made contributions to the nascent avant-garde film scene. The decade of the 1910s saw the rise of a new visual art movement in Italy called Futurism, which celebrated modernity over tradition, and its painting, sculptures, and other art forms portrayed speed, movement, and technology. Several futurist films were made in this era, but sadly only one, titled Thais from 1917, even partially survives. The film is most notable for the use of abstract, unrealistic sets that prefigured the German Expressionist movement of the following decade. The post-World War I era was one of decline for the Italian film industry, which lasted into the 1920s. Mussolini taking over in 1922 and strict censorship from the fascists didn't help matters. There were still a few filmmakers making quality work, such as Alessandro Blasetti and Mario Camerini. The most popular genre of Italian film in the 1930s were romances known as telefoni bianchi, or white telephone, named after a style of telephone that was indicative of wealth. These movies were infused with fascist ideology, as they were socially conservative and encouraged respect for authority and existing class hierarchies. A precursor to the genre is The Song of Love, which was actually the first Italian sound picture. Often regarded as the best example of a white telephone film is Everybody's Woman, from German director Max Ophüls. Italy's greatest contribution to cinema came in the 1940s and 50s with the Neorealism movement. I actually already made a video entirely devoted to Neorealism, so I'll just briefly summarize it here, and you can check that out if you want to learn more. Neorealism was heavily impacted by the conditions of post-World War II Italy, and the general disillusionment about the world among Italians caused by fascism. The movement had a monumental influence on cinema, with two specific examples being shooting on location as opposed to in studios, and the use of first-time untrained actors. Neorealist films also had a cynical outlook on life, and often focused on the working class or other marginalized members of society. They often had episodic structure and ambiguous or unsatisfying endings. The main films to start with are Roberto Rossellini's Rome Open City, Luchino Visconti's Ossessione, along with Bicycle Thieves and Umberto D. from Vittorio De Sica. Neorealism also saw the start of the career of likely the most renowned Italian director, Federico Fellini. He worked with Rossellini as a scriptwriter multiple times, and his early films as director of the 1950s are often associated with Neorealism. His 1953 film, I Vitelloni, is often described as being at least neorealist adjacent. It was filmed on location, but did have a cast of experienced actors, and was his international breakthrough. A great place to dive into Fellini is his next feature, La Strada, which won the first ever Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Another essential early Fellini is the episodic La Dolce Vita, which won the top prize at Cannes and even got Fellini an Oscar directing nomination, something quite rare, especially at the time, for a non-English language movie. Fellini was known for making very personal films, and there's no better example than Oscar winner 8½, a metafictional tale of an Italian film director and his anxieties. It was also Fellini's first to focus heavily on dreams and fantasy, topics that would become hallmarks of his in his later career. After 8½, Fellini's films would become increasingly surreal, with later films including Satyricon, Roma, and Amarcord. Another titan of the art house world who started out on neorealist films is Michelangelo Antonioni. His directing career began around the same time, but his fame came a bit later. While Fellini is relatively accessible for art house cinema, Antonioni's work was much more divisive. Influenced by neorealism, his films were de-dramatized and often focused on mundane events. His best-known Italian movies are a loose thematic trilogy made up of L'Avventura, La Notte, and L'Eclisse. They examine the alienation of modern society and portray detached characters that are lifeless, emotionless, and have difficulty communicating with others. They are slow films with long silences, and like many neorealist works, have unsatisfying open endings. Antonioni also had masterful cinematography in his films, with lots of long takes, camera movement, and deep focus. In the mid-60s, he started making English-language films, like the Palme d'Or-winning Blow Up and Zabriskie Point, a financial failure with a soundtrack that included bands like Pink Floyd and the Grateful Dead. In the late 1950s, a new style emerged that was later dubbed Commedia all'Italiana, which literally means Italian-style comedies, but refers to comedic movies made there from around 1958 to the late 70s. It started with the highly popular heist film Big Deal on Madonna Street, directed by Mario Monicelli, who'd end up being a mainstay of the genre. It also helped launch the career of Marcello Mastroianni, who would go on to be one of the biggest Italian actors and star in films by Fellini and Antonioni. Other important Monicelli films include The Great War and The Organizer. The genre got its name from Pietro Germi's dark comedy Divorce Italian Style, which won the Best Original Screenplay Oscar and got Mastroianni a Best Actor nomination. While comedic, these films didn't shy away from harsh satire or unhappy endings, as seen in Dino Risi's commercial and critical success, The Overtaking. Neo-realist icon Vittorio De Sica made his mark on the genre, with 2 collaborations with the most famous Italian actress of all time, Sophia Loren. These were Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and Marriage Italian Style. De Sica also directed Loren in her lead actress Oscar-winning role in 2 Women, making her the first actor to win an Oscar for a non-English language performance. Lina Wertmüller worked in the genre in the 60s, but became more well-known internationally in the 70s with films like the highly political The Seduction of Mimi. For 7 Beauties, she became the first woman to be nominated for Best Director at the Oscars. Also in the late 50s, we get the beginnings of a genre known as peplum, which is also sometimes termed sword and sandal. These movies were usually set in classical antiquity or based on mythology, but rarely stayed true to either history or myth. The film that started the craze, and is the best place to start with the genre, is Hercules, which was lampooned on the TV show Mystery Science Theater 3000, if that gives you any indication as to its quality. Despite wooden performances and cheesy dialogue, it's certainly not without a certain charm, and was a big financial success. Like many peplum films, it starred an American, with the title character played by Steve Reeves, a bodybuilder with minimal prior acting experience. Hercules and many other peplum protagonists were inspired by the strongman machiste characters in the silent period. Peplum was one of many trends that would gain popularity in the Italian film industry and then quickly die out. Some directors that will come up later in this video that made peplum movies are Sergio Leone and Mario Bava. The late 1950s and early 60s also saw Italy finally getting into the horror genre. The first since the silent era came in 1957 with Lust of the Vampire, and the director of photography was Mario Bava, son of Eugenio Bava, who worked as a cinematographer on silents like Quo Vadis and Cabiria. Mario was the cinematographer of dozens of films, including Hercules and Hercules Unchained, before directing classics like Black Sunday, Black Sabbath, and Blood and Black Lace. In 1971, he made A Bay of Blood, a violent precursor to the slasher genre. Bava's films didn't make a lot of money, but got a cult following that has lasted to the current day. In 1961, controversial director Pier Paolo Pasolini directed his first feature. He made several adaptations of religious and mythological texts throughout the 60s and early 70s, like the Gospel According to Matthew, Oedipus Rex, the Canterbury Tales, and the Decameron, written by the 14th century Italian Giovanni Boccaccio. But he's most remembered today for his final film Salo, which is considered by some to be the most disturbing film ever made, and his brutal murder in 1975. On to the mid-60s, we get the beginnings of spaghetti westerns. Like with Neorealism, this genre is such a big topic that I made a video solely about spaghetti westerns, and I'll just give you the basics here. The term spaghetti western refers to movies in the western genre made by Italian filmmakers in the 1960s and 70s that often utilize the same stylistic devices and plot tropes. They were known for their amazing music and stylized cinematography, and these films featured cynical anti-heroes and were often more violent and morally gray than a traditional western. They were inspired by classic westerns, and the Italian directors clearly had lots of respect for their predecessors, but they took the genre in a new direction. Like with peplum movies, American actors often appeared, with the most prominent one being Clint Eastwood. The obvious starting point with spaghetti westerns are the three films he made with legendary director Sergio Leone, collectively known as the Dollars or Man with No Name trilogy. A Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly introduced many features that would become genre cliches, like a cynical, unshaven protagonist, heavy use of zooms, and bold, colorful opening credit sequences. And all three had excellent scores by composer Ennio Morricone, whose sound became inextricably associated with the genre. The Dollars trilogy and his two other westerns, Once Upon a Time in the West and Duck You Sucker, combine art and entertainment to appeal to both cinephiles and mainstream movie fans. After that, you should check out the films of Sergio Corbucci, especially Django, starring genre mainstay Franco Nero as a taciturn gunslinger that bears a strong resemblance to Eastwood's character. Other key Corbucci westerns include The Mercenary, The Great Silence, and Compañeros. As spaghetti westerns were fading away, many of the cast and crew who worked on them were moving on to a new genre that would eventually be called poliziotteschi, or Eurocrime. Like spaghetti westerns, they were violent, highly stylized, and influenced by American movies. In this case, it was cop films like The French Connection and Dirty Harry, and mob movies like The Godfather. The genre was also a reaction to unrest, political violence, and terrorism that plagued Italy in the 60s and 70s. The protagonists were frequently tough, angry cops that had to go outside the system to achieve results, and spaghetti western star Franco Nero often played them. In the 1960s and 70s, a similar genre was developing referred to as Eurowar, but also sometimes as macaroni combat, as a play on the term spaghetti western. American war films were quite successful in the 1960s, such as The Dirty Dozen, The Longest Day, The Guns of Navarone, and Battle of the Bulge. These were all set in World War II, so of course the Italians followed suit, and most Eurowar films took place then, especially before the 1980s. An entertaining one for genre newcomers is The Inglourious Basterds from 1978, which is of course now more famous for having the same name as a Quentin Tarantino movie. In this period, Italy was also still making contributions to more serious cinema as well. For example, controversial art house director and Pasolini protege Bernardo Bertolucci had his breakthrough in 1970 with The Conformist, and became the first Italian to win Best Director at the Academy Awards for The Last Emperor. The 70s and 80s were huge for Italy in the genres of horror and exploitation. The big name for horror in this era was Dario Argento, and his most watched work is Suspiria from 1977, which is appreciated for its striking use of color and progressive rock soundtrack, among other aspects. After that, other Argento films to watch include Deep Red and The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Another major horror director of the era was Lucio Fulci. While he had been directing since the late 50s, he's remembered for his later films once he turned to horror. Two big ones are Zombie 2 and The Beyond, and zombies were a subgenre that did decently well in Italy. Around this time, there was also a cannibal movie trend, known for overtly shocking and violent films like the infamous Cannibal Holocaust. Italy put out many cult classic exploitation films in the 70s and 80s, like the horror movies of Joe D'Amato, including Anthropophagus and Absurd. While the 1980s was not kind to the Italian film industry, there were still talented filmmakers starting their careers, like Nanni Moretti, who also writes and stars in his often autobiographical films. Moretti is left-wing, and politics show up a lot in his work, especially Silvio Berlusconi, an Italian prime minister who served on and off from 1994 to 2011, and was eventually convicted of tax fraud. Moretti won the Palme d'Or in 2001 with his drama about grief titled The Sun's Room. Another director who began making films in the 80s is Giuseppe Tornatore, whose 1988 period piece Cinema Paradiso won the Best Foreign Language Oscar and the second place Grand Prix at Cannes. In 1997, easily one of the most well-known Italian films outside of Italy was released, and that's Life is Beautiful, directed by and starring Roberto Benigni, and set during World War II. Life is Beautiful made $230 million worldwide, with $57 million of that coming in the US, making it by far the highest-grossing non-English film in the US at the time. Even to this day, only Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon has surpassed it. It also won 3 Oscars, including Best Actor for Benigni, who also got a directing nomination. In the 21st century, Italy has still been going strong, with many new internationally significant directors making quality work. Among the most acclaimed is Paolo Sorrentino, whose 2013 drama The Great Beauty won the Best Foreign Language Oscar and BAFTA. Sorrentino also includes politics in his work at times, like with Loro, a 2018 satire about Berlusconi. Matteo Garrone has made crime dramas like the Grand Prix winning Gomorrah and Dogman, which got Marcello Fonte the Best Actor award at Cannes. He's also directed horror and even a family film with the 2019 version of Pinocchio featuring Roberto Benigni. Alice Rohrwacher has gotten recognized at Cannes as well, winning the Grand Prix in only her second feature, The Wonders. Her third feature, Happy as Lazzaro, released in 2018 and won the Best Screenplay at Cannes. Other significant active Italian directors include Gabriele Salvatore, Carlo Verdone, and Marco Bellocchio. Italy has clearly had a massive influence on the world of cinema and will surely continue to be relevant in the decades to come. The film movement known as Italian Neorealism was one of the most important in cinema history and left a massive legacy on the art form. The movement took place in the 1940s and 50s and was heavily impacted by the conditions of post-World War II Italy. The fascist regime led by Benito Mussolini that fell in 1943 strictly censored the film industry, and its demise led to new artistic freedom. However, fascism also caused a general disillusionment about the world among Italians, which is clearly visible in the Neorealism movement. Neorealism had a monumental influence on cinema, especially art house films. Two huge ways in which it did so were shooting on location as opposed to in studios, and the use of first-time untrained actors. Neorealist films also had a cynical outlook on life, and often focused on the working class or other marginalized members of society. The plots were structured differently than most at the time. They were less formulaic, sometimes episodic, and often ended in an intentionally unsatisfying or ambiguous way. Neorealists were inspired by poetic realism, a French movement from the 1930s that included director Jean Renoir, as well as Soviet montage, and the early work of Japanese filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu. Within Italian neorealism, many film historians have noted that there are 3 directors that clearly stand above the rest in terms of significance. Director Roberto Rossellini was one, and he exemplifies many of the traits I just described. His statements, "I do not want to make beautiful films, I want to make useful films," and "I try to capture reality, nothing else," do a great job of summing up the aims of neorealism. Rossellini broke through, gaining international acclaim in the aftermath of World War II. His 1945 film Rome Open City, set during the Nazi occupation of the title city, was a commercial and critical success. It was a huge step forward for Italian film, as it won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival and was even nominated for the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar, something very rare for a movie not in English. The leads are played by professional actors, but Rossellini went with first-time actors for the smaller roles. Although partially due to budget constraints, this film helped define neorealism in that it was shot on location and used lots of natural lighting. There was no need to create sets, as Rossellini filmed on the real war-torn streets of Rome, and many of the props and outfits were real as well. Rossellini also bucked the traditions of narrative cinema by having a main character be killed halfway through the film. The character is murdered by an anonymous soldier, and the film simply moves on without them. Despite all this, the film is not completely without artifice, and it doesn't shy away from melodrama backed up with a sentimental musical score. Among the scriptwriters was Federico Fellini, who collaborated with Rossellini multiple times, and would eventually become the preeminent Italian director of all time. I'll discuss Fellini more later in this video. Rome Open City is considered part of a loose thematic trilogy, with the second entry being Paisan. It is also set during World War II, but instead of focusing on a city, it deals with the entire nation of Italy. Paisan is made up of 6 segments, and Rossellini would often use an episodic structure in his films. He again used first-time actors, as well as mixing in authentic documentary footage with his fictional narrative. For his final film in the trilogy, Germany Year Zero, Rossellini moved from Italy to post-war Germany under Allied occupation. The cast was found on the streets of Germany, and the main character was played by a boy Rossellini found at the circus. It was Rossellini's darkest ending, and the pessimistic tone led to a lukewarm reception from audiences. Rossellini made a series of films with his wife Ingrid Bergman in the 1950s, and his work in this era still maintained some neorealist sensibilities. By the 1960s, he had moved away from neorealism entirely and started making movies about historical philosophers. The second director to discuss is Vittorio De Sica. He gained international attention in 1946 with Shoeshine, often considered his first masterpiece. Shoeshine was written by Cesare Zavattini, who would collaborate with De Sica many more times and become one of the major figures of neorealism. De Sica directed the most famous neorealist film, Bicycle Thieves, again collaborating with Zavattini. Like Rossellini, De Sica used first-time actors and shot on location. Another hallmark of neorealism was a focus on poverty in post-war Italy, and we see that here as the film follows an unemployed man desperate for work. Of course, this was an unflattering portrayal of Italy, and this was also common in the neorealism movement. Like Shoeshine, Bicycle Thieves also earned an honorary Academy Award, giving him 2 and 3 years, and its reputation has only increased in the decades since. It's often been called one of the best movies ever made. De Sica's other major neorealist work with Zavattini was also one of the last, Umberto D., a sad story of an impoverished elderly man and his dog. Umberto D. is a retired government employee whose paltry pension isn't enough for him to pay rent. The title character was played by linguistics professor Carlo Battisti, and this was his only film appearance. His friend, the maid, was also portrayed by a first-time actor, and there were some professionals in the supporting cast as well. We see a portrayal of the mundane when De Sica shows us the maid's daily routine in detail. Umberto D. is remembered more now for its more realistic and depressing parts, but these aspects were juxtaposed throughout with whimsical humor, mainly in the form of the antics of Umberto's pet dog. Umberto D. was a flop at the box office, and was even attacked by politicians for making Italy look bad. So it's no surprise that De Sica moved away from neorealism afterward to more lighthearted fare. The third director was Luchino Visconti, who started his career as an assistant director for Jean Renoir. Visconti was openly bisexual and even claimed to have a relationship with Umberto II, the final king of Italy. His debut and preeminent work of the era was Ossessione, which, having been released in 1943, is the earliest of the big neorealist films. In fact, it even came out a couple of months before the fall of fascism, and it was made despite strict government scrutiny and censorship. The film's dreary portrayal of Italy was not what the fascists wanted, and it was removed from theaters after early showings. They even went so far as to destroy the negatives, but luckily Visconti saved a duplicate. The film was based on the 1934 James Cain novel The Postman Always Rings Twice, but the Marxist Visconti added socio-political commentary. Ossessione centers around a wife cheating on her husband, and the focus on sexual immorality didn't help its censorship problems. The film does not present her infidelity as a moral failing, but instead the result of a broken society. Unlike later neorealist films, Visconti used established actors. The bored wife was played by Clara Calamai, one of the biggest Italian actresses of the era. However, we do see the neorealist tendency of focusing on members of lower social classes, as her lover Gino is a drifter. Visconti was born an aristocrat, but he was a member of the Communist Party for much of his life. The film was also shot on location in the Italian countryside and features scenes of a mundane routine. Ossessione is also considered a forerunner to the Italian horror genre known as giallo that thrived in the 1960s and 70s. Visconti did exclusively use non-professional actors in his second feature film, The Earth Trembles from 1948. In fact, they aren't even credited by name, but rather collectively as Sicilian fishermen, which fits in with Visconti's Marxist ideology. The Earth Trembles is more explicitly Marxist than most neorealist films, and was funded in part by the Italian Communist Party. The film deals with the exploitation of working-class fishermen by the upper class. Like the previous two directors, Visconti abandoned neorealism by the mid-1950s. Those are the three big names of the movement, but there's definitely more to mention. The aforementioned Federico Fellini is often associated with neorealism, especially his first films that came out in the early 1950s. His 1953 film I Vitelloni is often described as being at least neorealist adjacent. It was filmed on location, but did have a cast of experienced actors. His 1954 film La Strada contains aspects of neorealism, but is more often referred to as Fellini's break with the movement, or at least a bridge to his later more fanciful work. The acclaimed Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni started out with the neorealist apprenticeship, and his early documentary shorts were done in the neorealist style. A lesser-known filmmaker involved with neorealism was Giuseppe De Santis. We see the influence of Marxism and working-class characters in his 1947 debut Tragic Hunt, which features peasants forming a collective. His most well-known work came 2 years later with Bitter Rice, which got De Santis an Oscar nomination for Best Original Story. This film portrays the working class, but also criminals, fitting in with neorealism often showcasing societal outsiders. Another less remembered neorealist director was Alberto Lattuada. His 1946 film The Bandit, which played at Cannes, criticized post-war Italian society and dealt with taboo topics like prostitution. 2 years later, Lattuada made The Mill on the Po, which centers around peasant farmers and contains some anti-capitalist sentiment. He was also the co-director on Fellini's first film as director, Variety Lights. Other neorealist directors include Luigi Zampa, Aldo Vergano, and Raffaello Matarazzo. Also, screenwriter Suso Cecchi D'Amico deserves a mention for her collaborations with Visconti, De Sica, and others. Unfortunately, neorealism was a very short-lived movement, but its influence was anything but. It even inspired mainstream filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, as seen in his documentary on Italian cinema, My Voyage to Italy. The films noir of the 1940s and 50s were also connected to neorealism, with the director of the seminal noir The Naked City stating that the movement led to him utilizing location shooting and non-professional extras. These techniques became more common in Hollywood in the 1950s, as seen in the classic starring Marlon Brando, On the Waterfront. Neorealism changed art house cinema forever, and its influence can be felt in basically all of art house film. It was some of the earliest European art cinema that broke through internationally, and showed a generation of filmmakers that you don't need big names or a fancy studio to make something great. This was especially true in developing areas like Latin America and Africa. A direct inspiration can be seen in many of the movements of the 1950s and 60s, most notably with the French New Wave, with Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut both citing Rossellini as influences. French New Wave films often used location shooting, non-professional actors, and had social and political commentary. Furthermore, both movements started with film critics who weren't happy with their country's cinema. Renowned director Akira Kurosawa's work from the late 1940s is often compared to Italian neorealism, with specific examples being Stray Dog, One Wonderful Sunday, and No Regrets for Our Youth. The most celebrated Indian art house director Satyajit Ray was inspired to become a filmmaker when he saw Bicycle Thieves, and that's clearly seen in his Apu trilogy. Neorealism made Italy one of the major nations in the world of cinema for decades to come, and even to the current day, films are often cited as being influenced by it. Active directors with connections to neorealism include Chloe Zhao, Sean Baker, and Alfonso Cuarón. Roberto Rossellini was an influential Italian film director who was active from the 1930s to the 70s and was an essential part of the movement known as Italian neorealism. Using techniques and stylistic choices such as casting first-time untrained actors, episodic structures, open endings, and ambiguity, he helped make neorealism one of the most important movements in cinema history. His films aimed for a more naturalistic feel by avoiding traditional plot structure and using documentary footage, and he changed art house cinema forever. Rossellini directed some shorts in the 1930s, but his first feature as director was 1941's The White Ship. It's about a sailor in the Italian Navy, and none of the cast had acted before, with many of them being actual Navy members. The White Ship was also a propaganda film, and Rossellini had connections with the son of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. He then made two more war films, A Pilot Returns and The Man with the Cross, and these three are collectively referred to as Rossellini's fascist trilogy. Rossellini broke through, gaining international acclaim in the aftermath of World War II. His 1945 film Rome Open City, set during the Nazi occupation of the title city, was a commercial and critical success. It was a huge step forward for Italian film, as it won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival and was even nominated for the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar, something very rare for a movie not in English. The leads are played by professional actors, but Rossellini again went with first-time actors for the smaller roles. Although partially due to budget constraints, this film helped define neorealism in that it was shot on location and used lots of natural lighting. There was no need to create sets, as Rossellini filmed on the real war-torn streets of Rome, and many of the props and outfits were real as well. Rossellini also bucked the traditions of narrative cinema by having a main character be killed halfway through the film. The character is murdered by an anonymous soldier, and the film simply moves on without them. Despite all this, the film is not completely without artifice, and it doesn't shy away from melodrama backed up with a musical score meant to stir emotions. Rome Open City features a priest as one of the main roles, and Catholicism would have a strong presence throughout Rossellini's career. The film was co-written by Federico Fellini, who would later become possibly the most well-known Italian director. Rome Open City is considered part of another loose thematic trilogy, with the second entry being Paisan. It is also set during World War II, but instead of focusing on a city, it deals with the entire nation of Italy. Paisan is made up of 6 segments, and Rossellini would often use an episodic structure in his films. He again used first-time actors, as well as mixing in authentic documentary footage with his fictional narrative. For his final film in the trilogy, Germany Year Zero, Rossellini moved from Italy to post-war Germany under Allied occupation. The cast was found on the streets of Germany, and the main character was played by a boy Rossellini found at the circus. It was Rossellini's darkest ending, and the pessimistic tone led to a lukewarm reception from audiences. It was not long after this that Rossellini met Ingrid Bergman, star of Casablanca, and one of the most iconic actresses of the golden age of Hollywood. They got married, and she starred in 6 of his films during the 1950s. They had an affair while making their earliest collaboration, Stromboli, and this led to a pregnancy. Unfortunately, this was all happening while both were married to other people, and their relationship caused a scandal that put Bergman's Hollywood career on hold for years. A major work from this era was Journey to Italy, which featured great performances from Bergman and George Sanders, who had just won an Oscar for All About Eve. In this era, Rossellini also made The Flowers of St. Francis, about the patron saint of Italy. Not only is this episodic and a great example of the importance of Catholicism in his work, it was also the first of several films from him about historical figures, with an emphasis on religious and philosophical thinkers. Another historical film came in the early 1960s, with a take on Giuseppe Garibaldi, a 19th century general who helped unify Italy. However, the start of a new phase really came in 1966, with the taking of power by Louis XIV, about the French king who died in 1715. Rossellini's films were never super accessible, but this one is even less so, due to its austere nature and lack of any sort of melodrama or passion. It was also a TV movie, and most of Rossellini's remaining work was for television. He followed this up with a cycle of films about philosophers, starting with Socrates, a film about the Greek thinker from the 5th century BC that adapts Plato dialogues. After that, he directed films about Blaise Pascal, the 16th century mathematician and Catholic theologian, Augustine of Hippo, famous for writing the Christian philosophical text The City of God, and 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Rossellini's later films didn't have a big impact, but his career in general had a massive influence on modern cinema. His neorealist aesthetic inspired the French New Wave movement, with Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut both citing him as influences. His films were also seminal for legendary director Martin Scorsese, as they are a big part of his documentary on Italian cinema, My Voyage to Italy. Spaghetti Western is a term used to describe movies in the Western genre made by Italian filmmakers in the 1960s and 70s. Spaghetti Westerns often utilize the same stylistic devices and plot tropes. They also reused a lot of the same actors, including many international stars, and crew members like composers and cinematographers. Spaghetti Westerns are known for their amazing music and stylized cinematography, and these films featured cynical anti-heroes and were often more violent and morally gray than a traditional Western. They were inspired by classic Westerns, and the Italian directors clearly had lots of respect for their predecessors, but they took the genre in a new direction. They were crucial in the development of the subgenre known as revisionist Westerns, which turned the conventions of traditional Westerns on their heads. Spaghetti Westerns not only changed the genre forever, but also inspired filmmakers who make all kinds of cinema. When it comes to spaghetti Westerns, there's a very clear place as to where to start, and that's the work of a legendary Italian director Sergio Leone. Specifically, his 3 films, collectively known as the Dollars or Man with No Name trilogy, are the starting point for most making their journey into the genre. The first, A Fistful of Dollars, came out in 1964, and while it wasn't the earliest Italian Western, it undeniably started the trend of spaghetti Westerns. At the time, the majority of films in the Western genre portrayed a world with a cut-and-dry morality, and virtuous, incorruptible heroes. In Leone's film, Clint Eastwood's cynical character, referred to as the Man with No Name, watches a young boy get shot at, seemingly uncaring. He's unshaven and dirty compared to the typical Western hero, and instead of being selfless, he's opportunistic and looks out for himself, like many spaghetti Western protagonists. And he has a dry, sarcastic sense of humor. It's not just the characters that were different, but the settings, as the towns were shown as gritty and dirty. This was all part of a greater realism that included harsher, more sadistic violence. Leone's Western also introduced a new visual style to the Western, with kinetic editing and stylish cinematography. He combined extreme close-ups with drawn-out long shots in a way that skillfully created tension. And Leone often used zooms, a technique that would become a trademark of spaghetti Westerns. Leone also gave the film a stylish, bold opening credit sequence, which too would be prevalent in the genre. And of course, I have to mention the excellent music from Ennio Morricone. This was the first of dozens of spaghetti Westerns he composed the score for, and his sound became inextricably associated with the genre. Morricone is one of the most respected film composers of all time, has won an Oscar and been nominated 6 times, and has worked with directors like Quentin Tarantino, John Carpenter, and Oliver Stone. Morricone scored all 3 films in the trilogy and was yet another way in which the film went against genre conventions. Leone didn't want the traditional orchestral music common in Westerns, and as a result, Morricone changed the way film music is thought of by including unusual sounds, like whistling, gunshots, and whips cracking. His soundtrack was not just incidental, but an essential part of the movie. These stylistic elements are part of why Leone's films achieve the rare feat of appealing to both cinephiles looking for art and mainstream movie fans looking for entertainment. A Fistful of Dollars was an unauthorized remake of Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, and Toho, the company who produced said film, successfully sued for monetary compensation. The success of A Fistful of Dollars led Leone to quickly go into production on a loose sequel for a few dollars more. It again starred Eastwood, but also had a key new addition to the cast, Lee Van Cleef. It revived his ailing career, and he would go on to star in several spaghetti westerns. Van Cleef's character is looking for revenge, something that would become incredibly common in the genre. He and Eastwood's characters are bounty hunters, a profession that would also be portrayed in many spaghetti westerns. Also, a team-up between two gunfighters, with one being older than the other, became a highly used genre trope. In this, Eastwood is referred to as Monko, as opposed to Joe like in Fistful, but he looks and acts the exact same way. He wears the same poncho and has the same dry sense of humor. Whether or not Eastwood is actually the same character in all three films has been a matter of debate for decades, and even the subject of a lawsuit. Regardless, the stories of this and Fistful are not related in any way. You could hypothetically watch the trilogy in any order you want. The cast also includes German actor Klaus Kinski, known for his collaborations with Werner Herzog in films like Aguirre the Wrath of God. This was the first of multiple spaghetti westerns that Kinski appeared in. The second film in the trilogy is sometimes overlooked due to its place between the original and the more famous finale, but it's certainly an excellent film. The budget was higher than for the first film, allowing it to have a bit more of an epic feel, hinting at what was to come from Leone. And then we come to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, considered by many to be the definitive spaghetti western. This one gives us Morricone's most well-known score that is instantly recognizable to people who haven't even seen the film. Unlike the previous two, the music was written while the film was being made, and it's even more of an integral part of the movie. The final part of the trilogy brought back Eastwood and Van Cleef, adding Eli Wallach to round out the three titular characters. We see further evidence of the Man with No Name's questionable morals, as not only does he trick towns by collecting the bounty on Eli Wallach's character Tuco before saving him from being hanged, he then abandons Tuco in the middle of nowhere with no horse. Leone's third western was by far his longest at the time, clocking in at almost 3 hours. After you've seen the Dollars trilogy, you might as well watch Leone's next western, Once Upon a Time in the West. Again, the protagonist, here played by Charles Bronson, is far from a nice person, and he's solely out for revenge. Leone subverted audience expectations with the villain by having him played by Henry Fonda, one of Hollywood's biggest leading men, known for films like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. Fonda's villain is incredibly sadistic, to the point that he guns down an innocent child with a smile on his face. The third main character is played by two-time Oscar winner Jason Robards, who gives a fantastic performance. The film is even more of a deconstruction of the Western genre than Leone's previous films. It has many specific references to classic movies, leading philosopher Jean Baudrillard to call it the first postmodern film. Once Upon a Time in the West is similar to the Dollars trilogy, but slower and more serious. The story was worked on by two Italian directors that would later have huge careers, Dario Argento and Bernardo Bertolucci. Leone's next film and final western was Duck You Sucker. It was also released as A Fistful of Dynamite in the United States to capitalize on the Dollars trilogy, but has nothing to do with those films. Duck You Sucker is set during the Mexican Revolution that took place in the 1910s. This makes it part of the subgenre of spaghetti westerns known as the Zapata Western, named after the famous Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. It's therefore Leone's most explicitly political western, but he said the Mexican Revolution was only a symbol, and other directors would be more ideological with their Zapata westerns. It stars Oscar winner Rod Steiger, who you may know from In the Heat of the Night or On the Waterfront, and James Coburn, who appeared in The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape. This is probably Leone's most overlooked western, but it still has a lot going for it. The characters are a little more three-dimensional than usual for him, and they actually change over the course of the story. After Leone, there's a logical director to go to next, Sergio Corbucci. His films were also morally ambiguous and even more violent, as seen in one of his most famous movies, Django. which contains a gruesome scene where a man gets his ear cut off and force-fed to him. The disturbing content led to Django being banned in many countries. Corbucci's film was directly inspired by A Fistful of Dollars and has the same basic story. The title character is even similar to Eastwood, as actor Franco Nero grew out some stubble and was given fake wrinkles to resemble him. Like The Man with No Name, Django is an incredibly skilled gunslinger that doesn't talk much. And like many protagonists in the genre, he's looking for revenge. Nero and Corbucci worked together 3 times, and Nero would end up being one of the most popular spaghetti western actors. Corbucci's visual style was also similar to Leone, as you can see in his use of zooms, although his tend to be jerkier than Leone's. Django generated an uncountable number of ripoffs that use the name despite having no connection at all to the original. Another great team-up between Nero and Corbucci was The Mercenary, which was one of several Corbucci films scored by Morricone. Some of its characters are Mexican revolutionaries, making it an example of a Zapata Western. Corbucci and Nero collaborated on another Zapata Western in 1970, Compañeros. It also stars Tomas Milian, who is in several notable spaghetti westerns. A major Corbucci western without Nero was The Great Silence, which took the silent hero of spaghetti westerns to its extreme, with a mute protagonist. The title character is played by Jean-Louis Trintignant, known for later art house films like Three Colors Red and Michael Haneke's Amour. Also, Klaus Kinski gives a chilling performance as an evil bounty hunter. The Great Silence is unusual in that it's a western set in a snowy environment, which sets it apart visually from most entries in the genre. It's also an example of Corbucci's left-wing political ideals, since it depicts corrupt bankers and rich people hiring bounty hunters for murder. Like Leone, Corbucci wanted to subvert the conventions of the genre, and that's on full display here with one of the bleakest endings in Western history. Also worth checking out from Corbucci is The Specialists, another film with anti-authoritarian, left-wing messages that shows the wealthy as oppressors. Although relatively shallow, Corbucci's Navajo Joe is a fun watch, despite awkwardly starring Burt Reynolds as a Native American. Another important early director was Duccio Tessari, who co-wrote A Fistful of Dollars. His significance is mainly due to his 2 Ringo films, both with music from Morricone, the first being A Pistol for Ringo. It's a comedic, lighthearted film compared to a lot of spaghetti westerns, and doesn't address the dark themes of directors like Leone and Corbucci. The title character is played by Giuliano Gemma, who would become one of the bigger stars of the genre. His Ringo is much more of a talker than The Man with No Name or Django, and more clean-cut, which fits the less cynical tone. Gemma again played a character named Ringo in The Return of Ringo, but it's a very loose sequel, and it doesn't seem to be the same person as in the first one. Both movies were quite popular, but the second one is actually considered to be of higher quality. Like with Django, Tessari's films inspired dozens of movies to use the name Ringo in their title in order to capitalize on the success of the original 2. Director Sergio Sollima only made 3 westerns, but they are well regarded among genre enthusiasts, and they have a lot of political commentary. His first, The Big Gundown, features Lee Van Cleef as a Texas lawman and Tomas Milian, with the latter appearing in all 3 of Sollima's westerns. In Sollima's second western, Face to Face, Milian gets to play off Gian Maria Volante, who played villains in the first 2 entries of the Dollars trilogy. Sollima's films were about Mexican bandits or rebels teaming up with a white outsider, and he meant this as a commentary on the difficult relationships between third world countries and Western capitalist nations like the United States. His trilogy also has some of the coolest looking credits in the genre. Eventually, spaghetti westerns included comedy and parody, as seen in the 2 Trinity films directed by Enzo Barboni, who was the cinematographer on Corbucci's Django. Both movies starred the duo of Terence Hill and Bud Spencer, and led to them gaining international fame. They Call Me Trinity and Trinity Is Still My Name are full of violence and barroom brawls, but present the violence in a slapstick way. They were also some of the most successful non-Leone spaghetti westerns in Italy. Hill had already starred in multiple Italian westerns before these 2 films, like Django Prepare a Coffin and God Forgives I Don't, which also had Bud Spencer in it. Among Hill's later entries in the genre was My Name Is Nobody, from director Tonino Valeri, who had been an assistant director on Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More. The cast also included Henry Fonda in one of his final Western roles. Valeri also made Day of Anger, one of many examples of Lee Van Cleef teaming up with a younger gunslinger, this time played by Giuliano Gemma. Day of Anger is yet another spaghetti western with awesome, colorful opening titles. An additional instance of Van Cleef partnering with someone youthful was Death Rides a Horse, a revenge film directed by Giulio Petroni. The script was written by Luciano Vincenzoni, who also worked on For a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Corbucci's The Mercenary. After that, Petroni directed the Morricone-scored Zapata western Te Pepe, starring Tomas Milian. Te Pepe also has Orson Welles in a small but significant role, although he's playing a Mexican and wears unfortunate brown-face makeup. Generally considered to be the first Zapata western is Damiano Damiani's A Bullet for the General, starring Kinski and Volante as revolutionary bandits. It was co-written by Franco Salinas, a Marxist who also co-wrote the famous political film The Battle of Algiers, as well as other spaghetti westerns like The Mercenary and The Big Gundown. Giorgio Stegani, who later wrote the cult classic Cannibal Holocaust, directed a few spaghetti westerns, most notably Beyond the Law with Lee Van Cleef. Director Lucio Fulci is much more famous for his later gory giallo horror films like Zombie 2 and The Beyond, but also directed westerns, including 4 of the Apocalypse and Silver Saddle. Spaghetti westerns died out in the 1970s, and the last major one that's considered among the best is Chioma, a revenge film directed by Enzo G. Castellari and released in 1976. Franco Nero plays the title character, and it stands out among the genre by bringing in a supernatural element in the form of a witch haunting Chioma. This is just scratching the surface of the hundreds of spaghetti westerns, and I'd like to briefly mention a few more, like Cemetery Without Crosses, Django Kill, If You Live Shoot, and If You Meet Sartana, Pray for Your Death. Spaghetti westerns had an inarguably massive influence on the western genre as a whole. As mentioned earlier, they helped kickstart the revisionist western subgenre, and moral ambiguity would become a permanent part of the genre. Furthermore, Italian westerns had an impact on all of cinema, and their influence can be seen most explicitly in the work of director Quentin Tarantino. The most obvious example is Django Unchained, which gets its title and Luis Bacalov theme song from the Corbucci film, as well as having a Franco Nero cameo. He also used music from westerns such as Death Rides a Horse and The Mercenary in Inglourious Basterds, and the Dollars trilogy in Kill Bill. Tarantino explicitly referenced films like The Mercenary and Death Rides a Horse in Kill Bill as well. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, and let me know in the comments if there's any other topics you'd like to see a video on.